everybody, and welcome. Now, before we jump into the video, I just wanted to say thank you so much for stopping by. If you want to support the channel and help it grow, please remember to hit that like and subscribe button. I hope you enjoy the video. In this video, we're going to be taking a deep dive in this position that occurred between Shamsiddin Vokhidov with the white pieces and Magnus Carlsen with the black pieces. Now, the two met back in January in a title Tuesday. And for those of you who don't know, Shamsiddin Vokhidov is a very strong player from Uzbekistan. He was part of that 2022 team which won the Olympic gold medal in the Chennai Olympics. He scored 3.5 out of 4 on the 5th board. And he was also part of the team that won the bronze in the 2024 Olympics held in Budapest, Hungary. There he played board 4 and he won an individual gold after achieving 8 out of 10 points. So very impressive score there. He's peaked at 2684. This happened in November of 2024. And just incredibly strong player. Aside from that, dude's just an absolute menace when it comes to these online speed chess formats. He's always in contention for Title Tuesdays, Freestyle Fridays, you name it. So very strong and very resourceful player. Now, I found this position to be very interesting because at first sight, it just seems like Magnus Carlsen is easily winning this Rook Endgame. And he played pawn to h3, which is a blunder that gives away most, if not all, of his advantage. And my initial thought was, wow, he just blundered this, this winning Rook Endgame. But after I took a deeper look into this, it turns out that it's not as easy as one might think. So the way that the game continued was Vokhidov took on g7. Magnus played h2. Vokhidov goes with rook to h7. Obviously, you don't want to allow the pawn to promote. So the rook has to attack the pawn from behind. Carlsen takes on a7, trying to deviate the rook from the h1 square. Obviously, Vokhidov is not going to fall for this, so he takes on h2. Magnus here plays rook c7, cutting off the king from the pawn, right? So that the king cannot come to the pawn's aid and assist it in promoting. So Vokhidov plays the unfortunate blunder rook to c2, which actually loses a game on the spot, right? Now, you have to point out here, both players were in pretty severe time trouble. So had they been given a bit more time, I'm sure these blunders wouldn't have occurred. But just trying to play basically down to seconds, it's a very difficult position to figure out over the board. So Carlsen takes on c2, Vokhidov takes, and what I'm assuming is that he thought that this pawn was pretty much just, it's unstoppable, right? It's on the fast track to promotion, but it's not that easy. His position is actually totally losing for white. Carlsen goes with king f4, Vokhidov advances with b4, Carlsen takes on f3, b5, and here's a problem with this variation is that now Carlsen plays e2, so he's taking control of the promotion square. He's only 1, 2, 3 moves away from promoting, but one of those moves is going to be with check. So Vokhidov is losing an important tempo here. What else, right? You have to push the pawn b6. So Carlsen advances with check. Vokhidov plays a c3. Pawn to d2, b7. Carlsen promotes. Vokhidov promotes, and then after queen c1 check, Vokhidov just resigns because the only move is to step over into the b file, whether it be b3 or b4, and after any one of those moves, Carlsen has queen b1 check, and the queen on b8 is falling off the board. But if we go back here for a second, now this is why h3 is a blunder. Actually, let's go back to the very beginning after h3 blunder, because this is all pretty much forced. So Vokhidov takes on g7, Carlsen goes h2, rook to h7, Carlsen takes, Vokhidov takes, rook c7, and here we have the losing move rook c2, right? But had Vokhidov gone with rook to h4, this move is very strong. This would have been a draw, right? So Carlsen doesn't have a lot of good options here. He doesn't have a lot of good moves. So best try here would probably be to go rook c3 check. After king e2, defending the f3 pawn, Carlsen takes on b3. And here the idea of rook to h4 is to play rook e4 and completely cut off this king so that the king can't go up the board and help these pawns in promoting, right? So as long as the king is totally cut off from advancing, there's not much progress here that Carlsen could do. Right now, you could try, for instance, to go d3 check, but after king to d2, there's just no progress to be made, right? If you give check, obviously, you're just going to drop the pawn here on d3. So you have to keep the rook on the third rank here. So, for instance, if Carlsen goes rook to a3, now here's the idea. Vokhidov is just going to keep his rook on the fourth rank. He just goes rook to b4, king to g5, rook g4 check. And how do you make progress, right? It's impossible. He's just gonna stay on that fourth rank. Now, for instance, if you try to go around somehow and just go to king e6 and say, well, I'll try to come in this way. As soon as you step away, you can actually go with the move f4 as white and simplify this position even further. And it's just no progress can be made here. So as long as this king is cut off and you can't come to help with advancing the pawn, this is just a draw because this rook has to stay on the third rank. As soon as you leave the third rank, you're just going to take the pawn on d3, resulting in a completely drawn position. So then, if h3 is a blunder that gives away all the advantage, and we already saw why, which is the winning move in this position? It turns out the winning move is g5. Now, the problem with this move is that it's a little bit counterintuitive, and that's why it's easy to miss, and most likely why Magnus Carlsen didn't play it. The first issue with this move is that the pawn's on f3, right? White has a pawn on f3, which does a pretty decent job of impeding the g-pawn from advancing any further without it being exchanged. The other problem is that white is only one square away from promoting and has another very strong passer on the b file. So once this pawn gets to b6, which is able to support the a7 pawn, all the rook needs to do is come to the 8th rank and you're promoting, right? So this seems like a very straightforward and quick plan. So first instinct here is to just advance your passers as quickly as possible as well. Now, as the rule of thumb goes, passed pawns should be pushed. In this case, though, g5 is the winning move. So let's say, for instance, that white wants to play in the same vein as a variation with h3, right? So here after h3, Vokhidov took on g7, as we remember, h2, and then rook h7, right? So let's say, for instance, there's no h3, there's g5 instead, and Vokhidov goes with the same idea of playing rook to h7. Now we're going to take a look at a few alternatives here because there's many ideas that white can try. It turns out that they're all losing, okay? But let's go with rook h7 first. So if Vokhidov were to play rook to h7, Magnus now responds with king g6. And we see one of the first useful ideas of this g5 pawn is that now we can invest the tempo with the black pieces in bringing the king back and harassing this rook because the h4 pawn is defended. Before we couldn't do that, we had to continue advancing to h2 so that this rook would defend. And then that's where we got the idea where Vokhidov takes on h2 and Magnus takes on a7. And we simplify into that drawn rook endgame, right? But here, it doesn't work. You can't take on h4 because g5 has been played and the pawn is defended. So white pieces need to move the rook away. They cannot capture. So rook comes to c7. Magnus now pushes h3. And note how the rook can't immediately attack the pawn from behind, right? So that's a little bit of an issue already. Say, for example, rook c6 check, trying to remove that king from g6 where it's doing a phenomenal job of covering the h6 and h7 squares so that the rook can't attack the pawn from behind. King to c6. And now finally the rook comes into h6, right? Well, the problem with this is the black pieces can take on a7. White naturally takes on h3. And now we have rook to b7. And white is just running out of useful moves, right? So you want to come to the 8 of the pawn because otherwise the b pawn is just dropping and there goes all of your counterplay. So king to c4. King steps in now with king to f4. b4, and now this very useful move, very strong move, rook c7 check. What's the idea? So here, white has two main attempts, right? The most logical, I think, is to play king to b5 because we want to promote, right? So the king together with the pawn, they're moving forward. They're going to promote the b pawn and just win the game, right? Not so fast. Black pieces have a passed pawn as well. So we push with d3. The rook has to come into h2 because otherwise this pawn is just going to be unstoppable. And now king takes pawn f3. So all of a sudden we have 1, 2, 3 passers, right? Very dangerous. And white only has one on b4 with the king in front of it. So you have to lose a tempo just to remove the king out of the way and then start pushing your pawn, right? So king comes to b6 to harass the rook. And now we have rook c2. And this is just completely lost, right? Rook comes into h1. Obviously, you can't exchange rooks because if you take on c2, pawn just takes on c2. We're just one square away from promoting, right? Worst comes to worst, you could always just sacrifice the queen for this pawn, and then you have another 2 passes here. If you're feeling lazy and you don't want to calculate, you could just win the game like that. So exchanging on c2 doesn't work. The rook needs to drop back to h1. You have d2, and this is just totally hopeless, right? Absolutely hopeless. Rook d1, because otherwise black is just going to play rook to c1, right? Rook c1. You could give a couple of checks here along the third rank, but after king to g4, it's just game over. There's no more checks to give. So you go rook d1, and then you have king to e2. I think we don't need to analyze this any further, right? This is just completely lost. So that's if black attempts, or excuse me, if white attempts king b5. So let's say, for instance, after rook c7 check, white takes a bit more of a defensive stance and goes king to d3, right? The problem that we had in the other variation is that the pawn is just advancing to d3. So it says, all right, I won't make any progress, but I won't let you make any progress either. Let's just agree to a draw. Not so fast. Here, the black pieces have rook to c3, check. King comes to d2, and now e4. What a strong move, right? What a fantastic idea. Now, of course, you can't take because the rook is just going to drop on h3, and you would love to be able to win a tempo here with check, but you can't give check because there's a pawn on g5, right? This is the first move of this variation, of the winning variation, so you don't have any useful moves with your rook. So let's say that the king comes down because you don't have a lot of moves, right? If the rook steps away from the third rank, you're just going to take on f3. So king comes to d1, we have pawn to e3, rook comes to h1, pawn to d3, and this is just absolutely game over, right? We could take on f3. We could even play rook b3, threatening checkmate and taking this pawn on b4, and this position is absolutely and totally hopeless for the white pieces. So you've already seen that after pawn to g5, attacking the pawn, immediately attacking the pawn from behind with rook to h7 doesn't work, right? So white has other tries here. So let's say, for instance, the next most logical move, I think, is to play b4, right? So if we can't attack the pawn from behind, let's just advance our passers, because to be honest, at least at first look, these seem to be a lot faster than these, right? Because the rook is kind of sort of not misplaced, but it is taking on a defensive role here. And not only that, but this pawn, like we said, the pawn on f3 is doing a pretty decent job of stopping g5 from advancing. So what happens if b4? All right, so after b4, the black pieces can play pawn to h3. And now again, we have another fork. White can try rook to h7, or they can try pawn to b5. Now let's continue with the initial plan, right? The initial plan was to just advance our passers as quickly as possible. So let's say that white goes with pawn to b5 here. In this position, black can play h2, and now we can't advance the pawns any further, right? We have to go with rook to h7. Black takes on a7, white takes on h2, and now we have the very strong rook to a3 check. Now, what's the idea of this move? We're going to see it here in just a few moves. So after king c4, black could take on f3, and after b6, we have the very strong rook c3 check. Now the idea is that it doesn't matter where the king moves, we'll be able to position our rook in a way that we'll be able to sacrifice it for this pawn. For instance, if you go king to b5, rook b3 check, king c6, and now we're going to start advancing our own pawns, right? And the idea here is, after a few moves, let's say b7, g4, king c7, king e3, and then when you're just one square away from promoting, we can take that pawn, we could sacrifice the rook. Rook takes b7 check. Amazing move. King takes b7, and now d2, right? So you could try to take on g4. It doesn't matter because we're going to promote. If you don't take the pawn and you try to stop promotion with rook to g1, we simply have king f2. And after rook d1, king e2, and it's just game over, right? So that's the idea. The idea is that after rook c3 check, we're just going to give up the rook for the pawn, right? Let's say, for instance, white were to go with something like king b4 instead of king b5, we could just go rook to c8, right? Rook c8, and if b7, we have rook b8, so obviously that move doesn't work. And if the king advances, excuse me, we're always, as soon as the pawn gets into b7, we're just going to sacrifice the rook for it. And this rook alone cannot stop these three pawns with the help of the king. So then that doesn't work for white either. So here we were faced with the decision of either pushing this pawn with b5 or attacking the pawn from behind with rook h7. We already saw why b5 doesn't work. So what happens if we play rook to h7? It's pretty much going to transpose to the same idea, right? So we're going to have h2, b5, rook takes a7, rook takes h2, and rook a3 check. So we see this idea always exists as long as this pawn is no longer on b3 and it advances. Black is almost always going to have rook a3 check and these variations with the same idea of dislodging that king and just placing the rook on a square where it can stop the b pawn from promoting, right? So king c4, rook takes f3. You're always in time to take that pawn because of this check on c3. It's incredible. Chess is a game of just one tempo, right? So we have b6, rook c3 check, king to b4, and it's just the same idea. Rook c8, king a5, and we start advancing our pawns, right? So rook f2 check. So white is just trying to put up the most resistance possible, but this is just, it's completely losing, absolutely completely losing for white. You could try b7, rook to b8, king a6 defending the pawn, and we just continue advancing our pawns. Let's say, for instance, white tries rook f7 with the idea that we're going to start giving checks from behind and maybe attack the pawns from behind, try to stop them. The pawns are just too far advanced. So if you have d3, rook e7 check, king to f4, king a7, here again we could sacrifice the rook, and this is just totally losing for white. The rook cannot stop the two connected passers on the 6th rank, especially when the king is so advanced on f4, right? So we have pawn d2, rook e2, pawn e2. This is just game over again. So we tried attacking the pawn from behind with rook to h7. That didn't work. We tried advancing the pawn with pawn to b4. That didn't work either. So here in this position, white essentially has only 2 attempts left, and only one of those is actually a serious attempt. The other one is losing pretty easily. But here, that last serious attempt is king to c4, right? So then after king c4, we're going to pretty much continue with the same plan of advancing that h pawn, h3. The white rook goes to h7 to try and stop the pawn. Here in this position, though, we don't even have to worry about advancing the pawn to h2. We could just play king f4, because as we're going to see, it's not even necessary to defend that pawn anymore. So white takes the pawn on h3, black takes the pawn on a7. White then advances with pawn to b4, and now black has a very strong rook c7 check. Now here, once again, we're at a crossroads where white has a few options. They all lose, right? So the first one is king to b5. After king b5, we're just going to advance with d3. Now, white has to play rook h2, right? Because otherwise, If you just allow the pawn to go to d2 and then the king to come to e3, it's just game over, right? So the rook goes to h2, stopping the pawn from advancing to d2, but now the king can take on f3. So once again, we have it's pretty much similar setup, the same setup, right? With the 3 passers versus just 1 passer on b4. The problem is that we have the same idea that the black rook is going to sacrifice itself for the pawn on b4, and then the white rook can't stop all of black's passed pawns. So for instance, if king a6, pawn to e4, b5, rook c1, b6, e3, it's essentially a race, but only the black pieces can win this race, right? Pawn to b7, and now we have rook a1 check, king b6, rook b1 check, king c7, and rook takes b7 check, and after e3, it's just game over. So after rook c7 check, we already saw that king b5 doesn't work. So what happens if, again, white takes a more defensive stance with king to d3? We're going to see a very, very familiar idea that we saw just a few variations back. Black goes with rook c3 check, king e2, and you guessed it, e4. The pawn is once again pinned, and look at this pawn on g5 doing an exceptional job of taking away the h4 square so that there's no in-between moves or anything of that sort that black needs to worry about, right? King to d2, e3 check, king to e2 again, and this is just the pawns are just marching on, and white can't do anything to stop them, right? d2, king e2, rook c1, and we're going to have promotion on the very next move, right? So this is totally losing as well for the white pieces. And then finally to rook c7 check, white can try king d5. This move's pretty bad though. It doesn't put up a lot of resistance. The win is pretty straightforward here after pawn to d3, rook h1, pawn to d2, rook d1, and king takes f3. And this is just the perfect example of why king d5 probably isn't the best defense, because if you just take on d2, there's rook check. There's nobody sponsoring this rook over here. That's just game over, right? So after king takes f3, you could take on e5 maybe, but this is just game over. After king to e2, you're going to have to give up the rook for this pawn. You have another passer here, and then this pawn is going to drop. So you're probably just going to end up with a position of king and rook versus king, which is obviously an easy win for the black pieces as well. So the last attempt that white can try here is rook to f7 check, which the engine annotates it as an inaccuracy in a position that's just full of losing moves. This one, I guess, is worse in some way, but the win is pretty straightforward. There are some interesting ideas, though, so I thought it was useful to include this move in the analysis as well. After rook to f7 check, the idea is that white just wants to attack the pawns from behind, right? See how much damage he could do. But it's not much, to be honest, or not enough anyway. So after king to g6, rook e7, h3, rook takes e5, and rook takes a7. Now, so here, white once again has another fork in the road. A couple of moves that he could choose from, right? The first one, rook e2, with the idea, obviously, of stopping the pawn from advancing any further. Now, the problem with this move is that after rook to f7, there's simply no good way of defending that f3 pawn. For instance, if you go with rook to f2, this simply loses to g4, right? And the pawn is once again pinned. You can't take it because then the rook just hangs. So if you go rook h2, there's rook takes f3 check. Obviously, you can't go f4, right? Because that's just going to run into g3. This is very easily winning for black. So after rook to h2, there's rook takes f3 check, king takes on d4, rook takes b3, and these pawns are going to prove to be way too strong for this rook on h2. Now here, after rook f7, instead of trying to defend the pawn with rook f2, which we already saw loses to g4, if white were to try, for instance, king takes d4, well, guess what? This is also losing. rook takes f3, pawn to b4, pawn g4, and here it's very, very difficult to even suggest moves for the white pieces, right? But let's say, for instance, rook h2 to stop the black pawns from advancing. Black is actually in time to just go king h5, and after b5, king h4, b6, g3 hitting the rook. Let's say rook b2, right, to place itself behind the pawn and just push the pawn all the way to the promotion square. You're just not in time, right? So g2, the problem is you're promoting with check. So white has to stop the promotion with rook to b1, but even then h2, b7, and you promote with check once again. Now, if you don't take the queen, it's just going to be rook take b1, queen takes b1, and then the pawn drops. And if you do take, then it's just takes with check again, and then you're in time to stop the pawn from promoting. So we saw in this position, white attempted rook e2. That didn't work. What about b4? Advancing the passed pawn also loses. Rook a3 check. King takes t4. Rook takes f3. Rook to e6 check. King h5. And it's very straightforward, right? g3. And the rook drops back to e8 to try to attack the king from behind. But it's no use, right? You go h2 to make sure that you don't drop that h3 pawn, and just rook h8 check, king g6 check, and king f7, and it's game over, right? And if you go, for instance, instead of rook h8 check, if you try to go pawn to b6, this loses as well, this time to rook b3, king c5, and g2, right? The pawns are just way too strong. And there you have it, guys. What at first sight seemed to be a relatively straightforward position turned out to be a rook endgame that was full of complex and subtle ideas that, in my opinion, make this a very interesting and instructive position. And if you made it this far, I appreciate you watching until the end. As always, if you liked the video, have any comments or questions, I'd love to hear from you in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.